Up to this point, the G.I. Joe classified line has belonged to the Cobras. In terms of design elements and aesthetics, they completely overshadow the Joes. Almost anyone that I know who collects the G.I. Joe classified line collects strictly Cobra, or at the very least begins with those. And the reason I believe comes down to design elements, in particular where the facial sculpts go. That is, until a new wave of G.I. Joe action figures went up for pre-order back in March. This wave of pre-orders featured characters like Bazooka with the red jersey, Snowjob, Torpedo, Shipwreck, and this guy right here. Based on promotional images, these figures started to feature design elements that caught me by surprise. Hasbro, it seemed, was finally starting to figure it out when it came to the proper aesthetic for these figures, namely those not featuring headgear or some cool looking face mask. Encouraged, I put all of these figures in my cart, the first of which has finally arrived. And so I'm very excited to see, once and for all, if the Joes live up to the name of the toy line and take control back from the Cobras. Is my man Rock and Roll up to the task? So, though I had allowed myself to admire some of those initial G.I. Joe classified figures when I visited a Target or something like that, I would look at them, consider buying them, but put them right back on the peg. The way I saw it, Hasbro had already taken enough of my money and my parents' money growing up that they didn't need to take any more of my money now that I was an adult and knew better, right? I remember some of those Tiger Force action figures from the 80s. I mean, I convinced my parents to get me some of those, but even as a kid, I knew that Hasbro was suckering us into buying stuff that I already owned, just with different paint jobs. So as an adult, I was adamant not to fall into any more Hasbro traps. I was now an adult, and there, done that, I had officially outgrown G.I. Joe. But then I got into toy photography. One thing led to the next, and before you knew it, what started out as just needing a Storm Shadow to go with a Snake Eyes for a cool photo led to me getting Cobra Commander, various Cobra infantry, and, well, but I did hold my ground for the most part when it came to the Joes. That is, unless one of these classified figures featured cool looking headgear or a mask, I didn't get it, which meant I wasn't getting most of the Joes. It really came down to the aesthetics, the head sculpts in particular, on these initial G.I. Joe classified Joes, the Joes in particular. They're not much to look at. Flint was one of my favorite G.I. Joes growing up, for example. But initially he was an easy pass in this line, as was Stalker and Spirit, to say less of Falcon, because I just wasn't convinced by their design elements. I eventually ended up getting them, but as far as I was concerned, for a while there, this wasn't the G.I. Joe classified line. This line belonged to Cobra, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, yeah, the villains tend to be the cooler action figures in terms of design, but the Joes were pretty badass too, from what I remembered. I do want to say that I appreciate how Hasbro has given, right from the start, each of these characters a unique face sculpt, which of course is not what they did in the 80s with those G.I. Joe action figures, which had that I'm too cool for school face sculpt that they all shared, right? I also like to think that each of those facial sculpts on these new toys is based on an actual person. You know, in the same way that Tunnel Rat was supposedly based on Larry Hama's likeness. I like to think that there's someone at Hasbro headquarters right now admiring themselves as Torpedo. Having said that, these initial G.I. Joe classified action figures look too killer, too rugged, and you're thinking, well, these guys it's G.I. Joe. I mean, what are they supposed to look like? I appreciate that Hasbro was even looking to update these characters to look the way they would if they actually existed. The truth is, when I think of Duke, when I think of Flint, I don't think of an MMA fighter. Now, I have a lot more to say on this subject, but suffice to say that it isn't about nostalgia. It isn't about some bond that I formed with these characters growing up. It has more to do with something that I consider to be a major mistake by creators who tackle this kind of IP, which is going too far into the realm of realism, almost as if to justify the entire endeavor to begin with. That's one of the mistakes that the G.I. Joe movies make. They try to be a little too realistic, a little too plausible, and yet they still come across as silly and cartoony despite all of the protestations to the contrary. This is a similar phenomenon that I see in these earlier G.I. Joe classified action figures, coupled with the limitations in articulation, and despite Hasbro's facial recognition technology, these sculpts are never going to look completely photorealistic in the way that an SH Figuarts or even a Mofex looks. If anything, they detract from it because it just makes you even more aware that this is a toy. Does that make sense? In my opinion, these toys need to strike a fine balance between cartoony and realistic, which is what you get in a toy like Rock and Roll here. I wouldn't call this hyper realism, which is something that you get in a Christopher Nolan Batman movie. This is more hyper fantasy, if that makes any sense. I believe that for an IP like G.I. Joe to really work, at least those G.I. Joes from the 1980s, which is a different aesthetic than that of the original line of 12-inch action figures, you need to embrace the fantasy elements of this universe, or it doesn't really quite work, or at least it becomes something completely different. I mean, not that I'm into Cobra law or anything that fanciful, it could just be that it comes down to the aesthetics. So when I look at Rock and Roll here, I see a character that could easily exist in a comic book. He's cartoony, but not a cartoon. That's more Super 7 territory. I mean, this toy here doesn't have that overly saturated, super streamlined aesthetic of the cartoon versions of these characters. Here you do get enough texture, detail, and depth in the design to suggest a sense of realism. It's that fine line between cartoony and realism that I feel best captures the correct aesthetic for an IP like G.I. Joe. For example, think of Mike Zeck's classic comic book cover art from the 1980s, or even Frank Miller's earlier Sin City work. How the anatomy of the characters was correct, but it was just slightly enhanced to the point of being cartoony. So what are my final thoughts on Rock and Roll's design elements here? Have the G.I. Joes turned the tide of battle and recaptured the war from Cobra? I would say not. The Cobras are still in control, but the Joes are getting stronger. What I saw here in Rock and Roll is promising, and I'm looking forward to the new figures that should be coming in any day now. Entertainment Earth, are you listening? Having said that, I was really disappointed that this figure here only comes with one head sculpt. Before, I was a Hasbro apologist and used to say, well, you know, at this price point, what can you expect? No. After watching my friend's toy review of the Jada Toys Fei Long action figure, you should definitely go watch his review at Artsy Toys. It's a really good review. He thinks that figure is one of the best of the year, if not the best figure so far, and partly because of what it comes with at that price point. That's why it costs about the same as this one here, only that figure comes with two head sculpts, better articulation, and much better paint apps. As much as I like Rock and Roll here, and I do, this figure is still very limited in very important ways. This video was focusing more on Rock and Roll's design elements, but I invite you to stick around for more, as I do plan to do more comprehensive videos on this entire new wave of G.I. Joe action figures, including some of the ones that have already been released. In the meantime then, I'll leave you with a little rock and roll.